So during one, I injured my back, kayaking accident. So yeah, that took out 3 years of my life. I was under recovery for around 3 years, but when this happened, I just had to shut it down because it was not just me. There were other people whose careers were at risk. So we started that trust, and so far we have been able to give scholarships to 600 school-going girls and children. It's quite similar to how you build a customer ICP for startups. The great thing was that 70-80% people, they said yes.
Let's get started. Hi Manas, thank you so much for being here. Yeah, so we met at the so I hosted a startup event last Friday, and he was one of the main speaker, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Kaori hosted the event.
yes.
Yeah.
With Deb-san. Hi Deb-san.
Hi, Deb.
Okay. Anyway, let's talk about your amazing story. So tell us about yourself, Manas. What do you do in Japan?
I am the co-founder and CEO of Veritus. At Veritus, we make researchers vastly more productive by simplifying their complex workflows. I'm also an assistant professor at Osaka University, and I also am building a company to help researchers with my co-founders and team.
I see. Okay, so Veritas, when did you start Veritas startup?
Well, the idea behind Veritus was there for a long time. When I was working with Plug and Play as a venture capital analyst intern, the idea took shape then. But at that time, the AI technology was not there to sort of build this type of product. And after I graduated from university, then I took very focused and purposeful action to start Veritus, incorporate it, raise venture capital, build a team, and start pilots with the universities. So it was in ideation for almost 2 years, but we actually started building the product since last June. So about 8 months now. Yeah.
I see. Okay, 8 months ago, 2024. And do you have your co-founder?
Yes, we have a founding team of 3 people, and my co-founder is a pharmaceutical researcher from Ono Pharma, industry life sciences researcher. We have a founding UX engineer who is a researcher in a university. We have a senior engineer who is also from a research institution in India. So we are a team of researchers, and many of us also have been professors in university. So a bit of both worlds, yeah.
I see. So everyone researcher and everyone related to university.
Yes. So the team is very mission oriented. All of us have experienced the pain points that we're solving for others. For example, one of our teammates' paper was in peer review process for 13 months, and it cost the scholarship. The scholarship got over, the PhD was still ongoing. So that creates a lot of problems. Similarly, another researcher's research, it took 5-6 years, but they could not publish anything because of the repetitive cycle of literature reviews. So everyone faced these pain points, and we see all over academia and industry research that people are facing these pain points. So we solved it up for ourselves, and now we're solving it for other researchers.
I see. Okay, so super specific. So Veritas product is a AI software to help researcher in only university or some organization.
That is a great question. Our core philosophy is that AI is only an assistant. It's a tool. The true thinking, the research, the ideas come from experts who are researchers, whether they're industry or academia. They do the main work. So role of AI is to free up their time from manual, boring tasks, and so that they can focus only on building new technology. And that is what we are doing. So, researcher is at the heart of our product. AI only automates the boring, repetitive tasks. And at this point, we are starting with academic labs because they are easier to reach and do pilots with and sell to at this stage because we are only a pre-seed company. After this, once we have validation, traction, some revenue, we're going to raise a huge seed round, and then we are going to offer on-premise solutions to industry where we need more engineers, more infrastructure. So the strategy is to start with academic labs, show the value that we add, and then move to industry labs with some transition. Yes.
Okay, industry level. So I'm not familiar, but here is a Google, right? So Google has kind of many researchers. So industry level, industry researcher means including like researcher at Google as well. They may become your customer.
That is absolutely correct. By industry researchers, we mean companies like Google, NTT, Hitachi who do research. It also means life sciences researchers in pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies. It also means researchers in organizations like National Institutes of Communication and Technology. Like in Japan, we have a lot of national institutes. So in Tsukuba Science Park or Kihana Science City, there are a lot of such labs. So all these three are either industry or semi-industry labs.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's talk about your past story. So Manas, so you come from so India, right? So
Yes.
which part of India? Hyderabad.
I studied in IIT Hyderabad, but I come from a North India, very cold place, a Himalayan state,
Mountain area.
mountainous area. That's why I love the cold. Yeah.
So it's cold day in Tokyo, but here all are iced coffee. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so and then so I read your kind of article before we met today. So when you were university, you had something big accident, correct?
Yes. At the time, I was building another company. The name was Publicator. Idea again was to help students from tier 2 universities in India do great research because they do not have access to advisors, mentors, and technology resources. So the idea was to bridge that gap while building a sustainable business around that. But I did adventure sports quite often. So during one, I injured my back, a kayaking accident. So yeah, that took out 3 years of my life. I was under recovery for around 3 years between 2015 and 2019.
It was big challenge for your life, right? You started to build your first company, but you had to like plan B, plan C, right? Kind of pivoting your life. So tell us the story.
Yes, it was very difficult because with Publicator, we were finally reaching out to investors. We had done some MVPs which were successful. And when this happened, I just had to shut it down because it was not just me. There were other people whose careers were at risk. So if I was not well as the CEO, I would not be able to lead the team well. So it would not be fair to the team. So we disbanded the team and shut down the idea. And the next 3 years I spent recovering. So it was quite like a sudden upset, a very sudden low that I did not expect. So during this time, there was a major calamity in India, a natural disaster.
Earthquake?
It was a flash floods, like huge floods in which thousands of children became orphans or lost their fathers or their earning members like mothers. So these children were, they did not have homes, and they were from my state in India, my prefecture. So while I was at home undergoing treatment, I thought my life suddenly turned upside down, and these children's life suddenly turned upside down. And so my father and my mother and few other people were quite passionate about doing some philanthropic work. So we put together a small team of people, and we started a trust called PDGRB. Like it's again a mouthful. So we started the trust, and so far we have been able to give scholarships to 600 school-going girls and children. My parents do. They were government servants and lawyers.
Lawyer.
Yeah. But this was something that was happening around us. So many children being impacted, and I was impacted. And so we thought, what can we do in a small scale to help out? So I was at home. I was recovering. This is something we can do during this time. So we put together a small charitable organization, an NPO.
You and your team made a charity. So how did you promote like a special fund, right? To get money from like wealthy people or some company, and then to provide young ladies, 600 ladies. So how did you promote, or how did you, what can I say, foster your organization? And
Right, that's a great point. So there were two things here. One, I was was not very well during this time, so I had limited energy and time. And everyone else involved was a senior citizen. They were all like in late 60s or 70s. So what we did was we put together a list of people, like-minded people who believe in doing good work for society. So we had like 3, 4, 500 people, and we called them. We put together WhatsApp groups, and we said, okay, this is happening around us. Let's do something about it. And people came forward. People from, even my friends from Switzerland did his PhD there. He was there, he heard about it, and he was like, Manas, how can I help? So people came forward and contributed, and that's how we were able to give scholarships.
amazing. Okay, first, you guys made a list of people who has great, like a positive mindset, and who maybe already helped some people or organization, and then reached out to them like one by one. Hello.
Yeah, it's quite similar to how you build a customer ICP for startups. People you think in your close network, you think are ideal donors or ideal people who will support, and then you call them and you ask them for like some contribution. And the great thing was that 70-80% people they said yes, and quite often the subsequent years they kept contributing. It was not a lot of money, but every small contribution sort of.
Thank you. And I can imagine. So suddenly, big injured in your back, and then maybe you had to stay in your place, house, or at the hospital, and then it was totally big stressful, and then kind of a depression, right? So tell us your story. How did you manage your terrible time?
Right. It was very difficult. There was a lot of pain, of course. And my chances were either you get surgery done, and then there was some risk that it might cause severe complications leading up to paralysis. So we did not want to take those chances. So like you, I also did a lot of yoga, and then I found an amazing physiotherapist in Bengaluru, the Silicon Valley of India. So I would travel from home, which is 1,000 miles away, to Bengaluru for treatment and then come back. So it took 1.5 years, but gradually I got better. Like you, I did exercises, and it took some time, but eventually I got better. So during this time, you said that it's hard, and how do you keep yourself motivated?
Yeah.
So working on the trust, the charitable organization, that kept me busy. It was something positive that's happening that we were doing that gave some inspiration to move forward. And second, I kept doing something small. Like I kept learning about things, sociology, history, business. And I also published 2 research papers during this time. So I kept doing 1 or 2 hours or 3 hours of some productive work. Whenever my pain was manageable, I kept doing something. Like in hospital hallways while you're waiting, I would just read books on business or society, understand things. So that helped.
Thank you so much. It's great tips because of as a founder, every day sometimes happen not good only good things kind of wavy. So we have to keep our motivation kind of flat so that it's great tips how to manage our time better and to keep our mindset better, healthier. The 3 key takeaway from a conversation with Manas, part 1. 1. AI as an assistant, not a replacement for researchers. Manas and his team at Veritus believe that AI should enhance researchers' productivity by automating repetitive tasks, but not replacing human expertise. Their startup Veritus focused on freeing up researchers' time to concentrate on innovation and discovery. Example, one of their team members faced a 30-month peer review delay, which impacted their scholarship. Another researcher struggled with years of repetitive literature reviews. These inefficiencies inspired Veritus to develop AI tool that streamline workflows without taking away the researcher's critical thinking role. Key insight: AI should be a support system for experts, not a replacement. The goal is reduce manual work and accelerate research without compromising quality. 2. Building a successful nonprofit with a strategic approach. After devastating flood left thousands of children orphaned in India, Manas and his family launched a nonprofit organization that has now provided scholarship over 600 girls. Instead of relying on luck, they took structured entrepreneurial approach to secure funding. Step-by-step strategy. 1. Identify the right people. Manas and his family, they made a list of 300 to 400 people who had previously donated to causes on shown an interest in helping others. 2. Personalized outreach instead of mass fundraising. They reached out one by one, explaining the mission and how their contribution would directly impact children's education. 3. Create long-term engagement. 70 to 80% of donors continued supporting their project every year, providing the power of target, outreach, and relationship building. Key insight: whether launching a nonprofit or startup, success comes from strategic outreach and personalized engagement. By identifying their right supporters and building trust, Manas created a sustainable impact. Okay? 3. The power of resilience. Overcoming a 3-year setback. Manas faced a life-altering back injury from a kayaking accident, forcing him to shut down his first company and endure 3 years of recovery. Despite the physical and emotional challenges, he found a way to stay motivated, productive, and helpful. How he maintained perseverance during this difficult time. 1. Found a mission to focus on. Instead of feeling stuck, he channeled his energy into building the nonprofit support children in need. 2. Keep learning every day. Even while undergoing treatment, he read business book, studied psychology and history, and published 2 research papers. 3. Committed to long-term recovery. Instead of rushing, he trusted the process, traveled long-distance physiotherapy, and practiced yoga to heal without surgery. Key insight: resilience isn't about avoiding failure. It's about staying engaged, learning, and taking small steps forward. Even in the toughest situation, Mana's ability to persist through hardship shaped him into a stronger entrepreneur. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe it and give you a like. Okay, the next episode is Conversation with Manners Part 2. Okay, stay tuned. Bye bye. またね。